Annual military spending is rising globally at its steepest level since the Cold War. And after a break of more than 30 years, the US says it might restart testing nuclear weapons. So if the global arms race is back on, who's winning? How is war changing? And what's the true cost of escalation? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Neave Barker. Global military spending reached its all-time highest level last year, and it broke more than one record. More NATO countries than ever before spent 2% of their GDP on defence. And China recorded 30 unbroken years of increased military spending, the longest streak of any country in modern history. That's all in response to a world that's seen as becoming less safe. And as defence departments are spending money as a consequence, what they're buying has also changed. Drones, bombs powered by artificial intelligence and automated weapons systems sent weapons company profits soaring last year. Generations have grown up around the world in an era of arms control. So is that at an end? And what's at stake when the world's richest countries are engaged in a game of brinkmanship? We'll put those questions to our guests in a moment. But first, this report by Imogen Kimber.
The French Interior Minister browses security and military hardware and some of the latest defence technology. He's at one of the world's most important defence and security trade fairs, Milipol, just outside of Paris. Like many European countries, France is bolstering its defences. It's aiming to double its spending in 2017 by 2027, and also invest in defence systems in space.
To avoid war, we must build up our strength as a deterrent. What has fundamentally changed in recent years is that the world has become increasingly threatening. Wars are breaking out everywhere. And the one who has long been our protector at the European level, the United States, can no longer be fully relied upon.
That's as Europe grapples with a war on its doorstep between Russia and Ukraine, and with President Donald Trump in the White House, who's acting like a less reliable ally than the EU would have liked. That's because President Trump said he may reduce NATO funding, and other member states need to step up and increase their defence budgets. So many of them are, including Poland, Denmark, Germany, Spain and the UK. But along with France, their populations are struggling with a cost of living crisis, and dollars spent on defence could otherwise have gone to social programmes at home, as well as foreign aid abroad. Outside Europe, Russia is upping its spending on arms year on year. But living standards are on a downward spiral, with the cost of fuel and food becoming increasingly difficult to afford for many people. India and Pakistan are also increasing their military spending. Israeli military expenditure has been unprecedented due to its genocide in Gaza and attacks on Iran. And China has been slowly advancing its now formidable military capacity for decades. All this as the head of the most powerful military in the world, the United States, says he wants to resume nuclear testing.
We're going to have nuclear testing because other people test. We have more nuclear weapons than any other country. I'm the one that renovated them and built some, and I hated to do it, but I had no choice because they have it. We have more. Russia's second, and China is a distant third, but within 4 or 5 years they're going to be up with us.
He added he would like to denuclearise if Russia and China would agree to do the same. But in a world where the trend for major nations is for more, not less military spending, it's difficult to see any country being willing to scale back. Imogen Kimber, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
OK, let's take a quick look at the numbers on global military spending. Countries spent a combined $2.7 trillion in 2024. That's an increase of 9.4% from the year before. Compare that to the money the UN says is needed to end extreme poverty worldwide. Just $300 billion, a fraction of defence budgets. Europe was the main contributor to the hike in global military spending, with a rise of 17% in 2024. Israel's spending jumped by 65% to hit $46.5 billion. That's the steepest annual increase since 1967. And in Asia, China continued to up its defence budget by more than 7% last year. Let's bring in our guests from Camden, New Jersey. Michael Boyle is a professor of political science at Rutgers University, Camden, and author of The Drone Age. From Brussels, Elijah Magnier, a senior political risk analyst and a regional military expert. And from Madrid, Fabrice Pothier is the former head of policy planning at NATO and CEO of Rasmussen Global. A warm welcome to all three of you. Michael, if I can start with you, as we heard, US military spending surged to nearly $1 trillion in 2024, the largest figure of any country in world history. Meanwhile, global military spending has reached $2.7 trillion. That is $334 for every single person on the planet. Michael, how do you reflect at this particular moment in world history when it comes to the proliferation of arms?
So I think we're at an extraordinarily dangerous moment. The Trump administration has decreed that they will spend about $1 trillion on defense, which is a really dramatic increase on what the previous administrations have done. If you were to look at the Biden administration, for example, they were often spending about $780 billion. This is a really quite dramatic increase from the country that has the largest military in the world. It's also about 37% of global spending. And in part, the United States is doing this because I think there's a perception, at least, that the competition with China is getting more intense, that China is investing in a way that is in some ways forcing the United States to respond. Some of this is also, I would argue, a bargaining position. You heard President Trump talk about nuclear modernization. I think some of this is an attempt to kind of signal strength and see what kind of deal they can strike, potentially sort of limiting the degree of nuclear modernization, but that remains to be seen. But it's very clear that the United States is ramping up for a long-term 20, 30, 40, 50-year competition with China that will lead to vast amounts of increased defense spending with really what is the biggest military-industrial complex in the world.
Turning to you, Fabrice, because some of America's weapons spending goes on its allies. So we're talking at around $48.4 billion for the war in Ukraine, about $10.6 billion to fund Israel's war in Gaza and other wars throughout the Middle East. Is this, in your opinion, Fabrice, all about the US exerting global influence or about fueling and driving its own economy?
Frankly, I think we are in a new age, both a nuclear age, but also an age of confrontation between great powers, China, Russia, and the United States. And Europe finds itself in the middle squeeze of this strongman politics, global politics. So I don't think it's about fueling the US economies and industrial development. It's about responding to a threat environment which has greatly become more serious, where we are talking, and many intelligence agencies across Europe are talking about a possible Russian attack or aggression before the end of the decade in Europe. So Europe needs to step up, and part of the stepping up is also indeed to use some of the US systems where the US is the best in the field, especially air and missile defense, as we see in Ukraine, how important it is to protect your own population.
Elijah, Fabrice believes firmly it's all about responding to credible threats. The United States, Elijah, spends more on its military than the next 10 largest militaries combined. Its military spending is more than 3 times larger than that of its nearest competitor. No guesses on who that is, China. That's despite Beijing having a significantly larger economy than the US by purchasing power. Elijah, what is China spending its money on? And why this big spending disparity, apparently, between China and the US?
Well, first of all, it is not an immediate threat that we live in. It's a threat that we have invented and we put on the table because the previous US administration, Joe Biden, led by Joe Biden, said to the Europeans, we're going to conquer Russia and we're going to go to war with Russia, and it's going to be brief. Secondly, why China is increasing its spending is because of Taiwan and the presence of the US that is increasing in Asia and around it. Therefore, the threatening presence of the US advancing idea and narrative, belligerent narrative toward China is pushing everybody toward an arms race. Exactly what happened to the previous old Soviet Union when the Soviet Union collapsed because of the race and the arms spending. This is not going to happen to China because China has a very solid economy. This is why the Chinese are showing resistance in not meeting the threat of the US and NATO, and that is bothering the European and the Americans.
Fabrice, back to you. Elijah says the Americans are essentially whipping up a global arms race. I mean, we have seen military spending soar across Europe. Germany's now the world's fourth largest military spender and the highest spending military in Europe, fueled, I think it's fair to say, partially about how they view United States military support, whether or not the US will come to Europe's aid if push comes to shove. How much of that new spending in Europe is about the collapse of that long-standing security architecture that existed since the Second World War? Is that what is underpinning all this spending in Europe?
So I fully disagree with the previous speaker's point, which are mostly ideological points, and you need to look at the facts. If you look east in Europe, Russia, you have a nuclear power that has actually the greatest number of nuclear warheads, and that has been breaking away from all the treaties that have been developed during and after the Cold War to actually avoid conflict, from the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty to many others. You have further east China, which has actually joined the club of the plus 1,000 warheads, nuclear warheads club with the US and Russia. So I think it's completely logical for Europe to take note of this and actually to step up. And what we're seeing in Europe is not Europe engaging in an arms race, is Europe catching up with its own responsibilities to protect its own territory and its population.
All right, Fabrice, let me put that to Michael, because no matter how much you try and rotate the reasons for Europe spending more on its militaries, it has been under a huge amount of pressure, particularly NATO members in Europe, from Donald Trump personally, when it comes to ramping up their spending. And of course, the likes of Sweden and Finland have become recent members of the NATO alliance as well. Is Trumpian pressure the one to blame for this arms race in Europe? Michael?
I don't believe that it is. I don't believe that it is. I think it's far more complicated than that. I mean, if we look at the European government security position, in the end, Russia invaded Ukraine and has put Ukraine under enormous amounts of pressure. We've also seen China fund Russia. We've also seen other states like Iran fund Russia. The Biden administration's policy was essentially to draw Russia into a stalemate in Ukraine and force it back to the bargaining table. It wasn't essentially to lead to a long-term confrontation with Russia. In fact, actually, Biden administration policy was calibrated to avoid that. I think when we're looking at NATO spending, the Trump administration is maybe a step beyond what other presidents have done. But if you can go back to the administration of George W. Bush, you can see that U.S. presidents have long been asking for increased defense spending among European governments, especially NATO members. And what we've really seen is that the Russia threat has made this so apparent, so clear, that there's very little choice now in order to essentially defend yourself. And that's what we're seeing with Poland, for example, which has increased its defense spending by over 34%. That's what we're seeing with the recent pivot in Germany. It's not just U.S. pressure. It's a recognition of a real security threat and a recognition of that what happened in Ukraine could also happen to them.
Recognition of a real security threat, says Michael. Elijah, back to you. If there is a real credible threat, then it does involve a major trade-off, doesn't it? Because surely all this spending is diverting crucial resources from health, education, poverty reduction, climate resilience, the list goes on. I mean, that's a huge trade-off, Elijah. If given a choice, do you think this is what the people of these respective countries really want?
No, they don't want that, because we are tremendously suffering here in Europe from the cost of supporting war that is not ours. To speak frankly, if Russia was really a threat, they would not spend 3 years to occupy 4 provinces that they've started the war for, and they were about to sign a deal in April 2022. But Boris Johnson at that time blew up the deal because America was behind in saying, we support this war. This threat was created by NATO and by the European leaders who thought that that was an easy war because the Americans is meeting in Ramstein, Germany with 15 nations and planning to a war they can win. Well, we've lost because we didn't win and we didn't prevent Russia from advancing. Therefore, now what we are left is to increase the spending for the Americans to control Western Europe, not only Eastern Europe. So this is where we are at the time being. When Charles de Gaulle kicked out NATO from France because he considered any foreign country with the freedom to move in and out of the country, it means that the country is occupied. France brought it back from the windows. That is all about the Americans have nuclear weapons in Europe, and the Americans have a lot of nuclear weapons. The French have nuclear weapons, and they will never compete, the French and the British, what the Russians have. Therefore, it is not a race to stop an immediate war, but it's a race to control Europe.
Fabrice, is all of this worth it when it comes to alleviating poverty? I mean, the amount spent on arms is nearly 13 times the amount of official development assistance from the world's wealthiest nations, and 750 times the regular budget of the United Nations. What does that say to you, Fabrice?
It says to us that we're living in a very complex world where we do have those global and national responsibilities. And the truth is we have to meet all these responsibilities. And that turns then to how we generate the fiscal power to sustain both our security, but also obviously our health and our development. I don't think it should be about either or. I don't think we should be choosing between development or security. We actually need both. It just happens that we no longer have the luxury of sequencing them. We have to do them all together.
Turning to you, Michael, because I'd like to flip that question a little bit, because I want to ask you whether you think that there are any societal returns of having a war economy. I mean, Russia defied international sanctions, didn't it? And saw 2 years of robust growth when other countries in Europe were seeing financial declines. I mean, its entire economy was basically predicated around supporting its war against Ukraine. But now it looks like that bubble is about to burst, if it hasn't done already. The budget deficit is up. Defence spending appears to have levelled off. But do you think that there are any returns at all to be gained from the industrial military complex driving a nation like Russia?
So I would say there are short-term gains and possibly long-term losses. There's clear evidence that, supporting a war, for example, as Russia has done, as the United States did during the Second World War, can stimulate an economy and kind of build an industrial infrastructure. There's no question that it can do that in the short run. The question is whether that's a long-term sustainable economy. The U.S., for example, has enormous defense manufacturers and defense contractors that will certainly make a lot of money off of the $1 trillion that the Pentagon is planning to spend on defense. And I'm sure in the short run, that will stimulate the U.S. economy. In the long run, I don't know how sustainable that is. Now, it does matter a little bit what you're building. So, for example, if you're building things that are tanks, for example, the sort of spillover to the commercial economy may be limited. Now, we do know that some defense spending, for example, on drones, has a spillover back to the commercial economy. In other words, you invest in drones, and that gives you a leg up in a commercial field. So there are cases under which you see sort of secondary benefits for commercial fields. I think the larger term question is what you want your economy to look like. So, if I might be critical of the United States, spending $1 trillion on defense is potentially justifiable on the basis of some security threats that they're facing. However, there is a real problem if that comes at the cost of, for example, foreign aid, or it comes in the cost of poverty assistance. And there is a way to build a sustainable economy where you use all of these levers of power in a more balanced way than I think the Trump administration has been doing.
I want to ask a pretty basic question, and that's basically whether all of this can be done cheaper, because in many ways, this isn't just about having the largest traditional army. It's about working smarter with new technology. On that point, I want you to take a listen to this. Here's what the former US President Barack Obama said during a presidential debate back in 2012.
You mentioned the Navy, for example, and that we have fewer ships than we did in 1916. Well, Governor, we also have fewer horses and bayonets because the nature of our military has changed. We have these things called aircraft carriers where planes land on them. We have these ships that go underwater, nuclear submarines. And so the question is not a game of battleship where we're counting ships. It's what are our capabilities?
Barack Obama there speaking in a very different era in global politics. So that was a while ago. But I wonder, Elijah, whether the essence of what Obama had to say then still stands, given the proliferation of, for instance, cheaply made drones in Ukraine. I mean, their capabilities may be crude, but if you compare them with traditional fighter aircraft and long-range precision strike missiles, they're a pretty good alternative.
Well, this is a bit behind us now, because if we look at the war between Israel and Iran. Israel dominated the sky over Iran with its air force, but the Iranian dominated the sky over Israel with its missiles. Today, what we have done is we have introduced modern warfare to all countries, including and above all Russia. In 2022, the Russian army was so back, not having even drones. We told the Russians to go and look for a modern technology to be able to fight the modern war that the West is fighting it. Therefore, today, everybody has a drone. Many people can make missiles very cheaply and bring down drones that cost millions of dollars with $10,000 of small missiles, or send a drone that costs very cheap and then send them anywhere, but cutting even 2,000 kilometers, as we have seen in the war in the Middle East. Therefore, the technology today, a submarine that are non-guided by human, we have seen boats that not guided by human, not only drones, all that today is available to many actors and non-state actors.
Fabrice, turning to you, I mean, if Ukraine has taught us anything, it's that it can be cheap to attack, but it still appears to be quite expensive to defend. I mean, what about these defensive capabilities? We've seen the US, European forces, the Israeli Air Force and missile defences doing well in recent conflicts, but defending a nation comes at a very hefty price tag, Fabrice.
Because this requires certain capabilities like interceptors, air and missile defense, anti-drone systems that are either very expensive or not yet developed at scale. But going back to the bigger point, I think the challenge we face across the Western world is we need to do both. We need to both develop the military mass, especially in Europe, where we have lost that mass since the end of the Cold War, and we are no longer able to deploy more than 10, maybe 20,000 really readily operational forces, is despite the fact that we have 1+ million soldiers across Europe. So we need to rebuild that mass, but at the same time, and this is one of the lessons from Ukraine, we need to develop the edge. We need to develop more modern and sometimes cheaper, more attritional capabilities like drones, but not only, that allow us to basically fight a war where the enemy is most likely to want to saturate our space, to saturate our front line. And we need to respond to that with, in a way, cheap solutions that can be built en masse.
Well, the very opposite of cheap solutions, and we've all touched upon it over the discussion so far, as the proliferation of nuclear weapons. Michael, in 3 months' time, the last remaining nuclear weapons treaty between the US and Russia expires. Putin has said he's suspending participation on expiry for the first time in years. Nuclear threats, we all know it, were used by Putin to try and encourage Western forces to stay out of intervening in Ukraine. And now the US President Donald Trump has announced the US will immediately resume nuclear weapons tests not done since 1992. Michael, I mean, can anyone really afford a nuclear arms race? I mean, these are weapons that remain inconceivable to many in modern warfare.
I mean, there's no question that nuclear modernization is extraordinarily expensive, and it's come under substantial criticism in the United States for saying, look, should we be doing this rather than investing in drones, rather than investing in AI, rather than investing in autonomy? To some extent, I think there's an inevitability here. If China is going to invest in its nuclear forces, if Russia is going to invest in its nuclear forces, if there will be modernization, the United States is in some ways obliged to keep up. My hope is that the Trump administration might be able to strike some deal. Trump is always paradoxical on this. He'll threaten and then often say at the next breath that he'd like to have some sort of negotiation on this. My hope would be that eventually there would be some limits on nuclear modernization precisely because of that reason. The cost is so enormous that you, number one, shouldn't do it for your economy, and number two, in the long run, it's going to pose cost on other forms of procurement, which you might actually need if you're fighting a conflict like we see today in Ukraine.
As we reach the end of this discussion, I want to put one question to all three of you if we have time. Starting with you, Elijah. How sustainable do you think is the current trajectory of military spending?
It is sustainable because there is a race today, even among allies. If we take, for example, Qatar, after the attack from the Israelis, they went to the American to buy more weapons and to sign a deal of defense. Saudi Arabia did the same. All that is increasing. We see more money spent on the defense to deter the enemy or to deter any opponent or any other country that thinks to attack, or perhaps prepare for a possibility of war, because warmongering is more dominant today on the international arena.
Although I think it's worth pointing out that particularly when it comes to the Middle East, major rises in spending were only limited to Israel and Lebanon. Saudi Arabia remains the biggest military spending, just below the United Kingdom. But we've also seen spending cut by 10% in Iran. Fabrice, can I put that same question to you? How sustainable is the current trajectory of military spending?
We see this is a new fiscal pressure on governments and on taxpayers. But I would turn the question differently. I would say, what does it take to restore some form of stability, both in the European security architecture, but also more globally? And I think that's the real question that should be on top of the agenda of our leaders, which is, how much do I need of strength to be able to restore and guarantee peace?
Okay, well, let me put that
possibly,
Thanks for that question, Fabrice, because let me put that to Michael. Michael.
I would say it's in the short run sustainable for the United States, for the long run perhaps unsustainable. The United States, for example, is on a trajectory to be $38 trillion in debt. We'll have 120% of GDP debt ratio. At a certain point, that's going to be a trade-off. So can the U.S. sustain it over the next 5 to 10 years? Yes. After about 10 years, if we keep up this pace of military spending, there's going to be some hard choices in terms of domestic spending.
Hard choices, Fabrice. What does that mean to you?
Our choices mean obviously we'll have to maybe have to cut certain programs, but I don't believe we'll reach this point. Also, because if you look at Europe, it's not going to be only public money that is going to do it. We will have to mobilize more private capital. There's a huge deficit of capital risk going to the defense sector in Europe. So I don't think it's only governments and taxpayers who should carry that burden. It should be actually investors who should see opportunities here.
Understood. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure to speak to all three of you. I've learned a tremendous amount. It seems like there's some way to go in fully understanding the implications of all of this global spending on arms, but we've got some way there. So Michael Boyle, Elijah Magnier, Fabrice Pothier. It's been a pleasure to have you on Inside Story. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For me, Neave Barker, and the whole team here in Doha. Bye for now.